podcast do. Explore what's all on their minds. Yeah, not a thing or two, or about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, our topic this week is doom. Doom. Or specifically the Doomsday Clock. There's this phenomenon called catastrophizing, which is showing up, I think, repeatedly in media and reporting today, analysis, where people take bad situations and just report on them as if is inescapable doom. And the whole term doom scrolling has been popularized as the experience of going through just massively bad things within social media and elsewhere and being unable to turn away from it. And I feel like that's a really interesting topic in general and one well worth examining. And in this case, we have a specific example of catastrophizing, which is the aptly named Doomsday Clock. And I do not know the full history of that. That's one of the things I asked you about. But I do know that it goes back through the better part of my life, where every now and then I will hear that the Doomsday Clock has come closer to midnight, where within the metaphor, midnight is when we're all doomed, when we will destroy ourselves and Earth will become an irradiated husk, lacking all life. And I've always wondered, who are the people behind the Doomsday Clock? Who decides what time it's on? What criteria do they use? And really, what do they think they're accomplishing by scaring us all in this way? So I asked you about the Doomsday Clock, its history, and the people who run it. And I look forward to hearing what you learned.
Yeah, well, thanks for this question. And I want to start by saying this was an interesting question for me because it didn't fit the usual pattern. Let me explain what I mean by that. Usually, the research is tough because your question is either difficult or multi-layered, but I usually have a good feel for where I stand on the subject very early in my research. This episode was kind of the opposite. The question was straightforward, the research was easy, but I'm ambivalent about the Doomsday Clock's impact on the world. So that's my way of saying get ready for some serious hedging on my part.
Okay.
The Doomsday Clock was created in 1947 as a metaphor for humanity's proximity to self-destruction by way of dangerous technologies of its own making.
I am already surprised. I had no idea it went all the way back to 1947. I would have guessed some point in like the 60s around the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, interesting. Well, I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but no, it goes back to right after World War II. And as you mentioned, midnight represents the end of the world, the point at which we've rendered the Earth uninhabitable. The clock was created and is managed by the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in consultation with a separate board called the Board of Sponsors. I'll say more about the composition of those boards in a minute, but I want to start with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists itself, which is a nonprofit organization founded in 1945 by 200 scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After the bombings, they began publishing a mimeographed newsletter that morphed into a magazine, also called Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. That founding group included legendary scientists like Albert Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer. Even as they developed the first atomic weapons, they had profound misgivings about the consequences of using them on humanity and the destructive forces they had unleashed on humankind. The group's mission, as stated in its founding documents, was, quote, to equip the public, policymakers, and scientists with the information needed to reduce man-made threats to our existence, end quote. More than 80 years later, the Bulletin still exists as an independent organization, publishing a bi-monthly online magazine in addition to the Doomsday Clock. And here's a trivia question for you, Mark. What was the original name of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists?
I'm tempted to suggest Kaboom, but probably not.
Not quite.
Well, considering these are scientists and particle physics scientists in particular, I can't imagine it was a particularly creative title. So I'm thinking something very, very boring and straightforward.
Yes.
But I do not know. What was the answer?
Yes, you were right about it being boring and straightforward, but it's notable for reasons that will become immediately obvious to you. The answer is the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists of Chicago.
Oh.
Since so much of the work on the Manhattan Project took place at our alma mater, the University of Chicago.
Yes, you're reminding me that it was beneath the football field at the University of Chicago.
Correct.
Right? Yeah. So those students who were coming out for games were unknowingly possibly being subject to irradiation from the science experiments beneath the surface of the field.
Perhaps. And incidentally, you can visit the Doomsday Clock at the Bulletin's offices in the School of Public Policy on the U of C campus, which I did not know until I researched this topic.
No, between college and graduate school, I spent more than a decade on that campus, and I had no idea that that clock even existed. I asked this question thinking that the clock was metaphorical, and now you're telling me that not only was it physical, but that I lived in close proximity to it for a number of years and never knew that it was there.
Yes, it's physical, but it's not real, and I'll get into that very shortly. The clock was designed by Martil Langsdorff, an artist and the wife of one of the Manhattan Project physicists, as the cover illustration for the first issue of the Bulletin's magazine. As I just said, it's not an actual ticking clock. It's just the top left quadrant of a clock face, the last quarter of the hour, and it has no numbers. Langsdorff initially set its hands at 7 minutes to midnight, quote, simply because it looked good, end quote.
Yeah.
One writer for The Atlantic described Langsdorff's clock design as, quote, a brutally simple visual analogy, merging the looming approach of midnight with the drama of a ticking time bomb, end quote. I'll put a link to the original Bulletin magazine with the clock design on our Facebook page because I agree it's a compelling image. Part of the clock's power lies in the way it makes you want to stop or even reverse the seemingly inexorable march to midnight. I wish I had the words to adequately describe what looking at the clock face does to me.
If I could turn back time, if I could find a way.
Why, yes, thank you, Cher. That's exactly what I was trying to say. Some artists just have their fingers on the pulse of modern life. Wouldn't you agree, Mark?
Absolutely. Yeah. Cher captured a moment in time. She started with Sunny in the 70s, then she ditched Sunny in the 80s and 90s. She was the top of the world, and if we could turn back time, we'd go back to when Cher was queen of pop.
Everyone thinks that's just a love song, but who knew it was about the Doomsday Clock the whole time?
Yeah. Cher knew. She knew.
The Bulletin's Science and Security Board currently consists of 18 experts in fields ranging from policy and diplomacy to military history and nuclear science. They consult widely with colleagues across a range of disciplines while also seeking input from the Bulletin's Board of Sponsors. The Board of Sponsors was started in December 1948 by Einstein and had Oppenheimer as its first chair. Board members are typically recruited by their peers from the world's most accomplished scientific, security, and related organizations. The historical roster of board members is a veritable A-team of science VIPs, including not only Einstein and Oppenheimer, but also the physicists Edward Teller and Stephen Hawking. the chemist Linus Pauling, the Nobel Peace Prize winner Andrei Sakharov, and the sci-fi author Arthur C. Clarke. The current board includes 8 Nobel laureates. For the first couple decades of the Doomsday Clock's existence, whether and how much to move its hands was determined by one man, the Russian-American biophysicist and Manhattan Project contributor Eugene Rabinowitch, who was the Bulletin's editor-in-chief and had become a leader in the post-World War II movement for global disarmament. He's an interesting character because he was clearly haunted by the role he played in developing the A-bomb. So haunted that in 1971, he told the New York Times, quote, "Before the atom bomb drops on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I had spent sleepless nights thinking that I should reveal to the American people, perhaps through a reputable news organ, the fateful act, the first introduction of atomic weapons, which the U.S. government planned to carry out without consultation with its people. I feel I would have been right if I had done so." End quote. Rabinowitch described the Bulletin's purpose as managing, quote, "the dangerous presence of Pandora's box of modern science," end quote. His first clock-related decision came in October 1949 after the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, when he moved the clock from its original setting of 7 minutes to midnight up to 3 minutes to midnight. Since its inception, the clock has been reset 27 times, backward 8 times, and forward 19 times. Since Rabinowicz's death in 1973, the 2 boards took over the resetting of the clock's hands. In resetting the time on the Doomsday Clock, the board claims to be assessing whether humanity is safer or at greater risk than it was the prior year, and how humanity's level of safety that year compares to the past nearly 8 decades. Sometimes they decide not to move the hands. At its inception, in the aftermath of World War II and the dropping of 2 A-bombs on Japan, the time set on the Doomsday Clock was based solely on the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation, which was understandably considered to be the greatest danger to humanity at that time. In 2007, the board began considering the progress or lack thereof in addressing climate change and decarbonization in its clock setting, including treaty compliance and the handling of environmental disasters. 2007 was also the year that the clock setting and the press conference announcing it were turned into an annual event in late January, with video clips and a public statement from the board. More recently, the board has begun considering emergent threats from infectious diseases and disruptive technologies like AI and biotechnology, plus threat multipliers like declining cybersecurity and mis- and disinformation. And of course, wars like the ones in Ukraine and Iran destabilize the world and are always factored into the board's deliberations. These days, the board meets twice a year, including an in-person meeting in Chicago in November, to debate global developments and evaluate the continuing dangers faced by humanity and whether they warrant a time change on the clock. Now, I went into my research for this episode expecting the Cuban Missile Crisis that we already mentioned to have been the closest to midnight the Doomsday Clock was ever set.
Yeah, particularly since in retrospect, I think many people would say that is the closest we came to nuclear Armageddon, that it could have happened there and we escaped it by just the smallest of margins. So, yeah.
Yeah, so here's why it wasn't the closest we ever came on the clock. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 happened between issues of the Bulletin, when the clock was set at 7 minutes to midnight, and did not prompt an immediate clock change. However, the crisis did lead indirectly to the signing of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty by the US, UK, and Soviet Union in August 1963, which slowed the arms race by ending all atmospheric nuclear testing and signaled awareness between Cold War powers that they had to work together to stave off all-out nuclear war. As it turned out, that treaty signing resulted in Eugene Rabinowitz setting the Doomsday Clock back to 12 minutes before midnight. So the Cuban Missile Crisis indirectly led to setting the clock back, which really counterintuitive, but so be it.
Yeah, exactly the opposite of what I would have expected.
Yeah. Now, in case you're wondering, the closest we've ever been to doomsday on the clock is right now, 2026. On January 27th, the bulletin announced that we were only 85 seconds from midnight, a forward movement of 4 seconds from last year. And I think that announcement is probably what put this in your head while you asked me this question.
It wasn't, because I didn't hear the actual time on the clock. It was just the announcement that we'd move closer to midnight reminded me that, oh yeah, this is a thing.
Yeah.
But it does suggest that there's sort of a grade inflation where the Doomsday Clock is concerned, where as bad things happen, we are inclined to move the clock forward more than we're inclined to move it back.
Yes.
Like you mentioned, it's moved forward 19 times. It's moved back 8 times.
Correct.
You wonder when they're going to run out of seconds. Are we going to go to fractions of a second, tenths of a second, hundredths of a second, just as we get closer and closer to alleged midnight, and they still feel the need to move it closer.
Yeah, so you're anticipating a lot of the really good criticism about the Doomsday Clock that I'm going to unpack a little bit later. But I want to say a little more about why we're this close to doomsday right now. The statement released by the Bulletin accompanying this move to 85 seconds to midnight listed several factors for the worsening threat level, including the potential for loose nukes during ongoing wars, the world's failure to meet climate change goals, and the quote-unquote information Armageddon triggered by generative AI's contributions to conspiracy theories and other sources of mis- and disinformation. Notably, the Bulletin cited the imminent expiration on February 5th of the sole remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the U.S. and Russia, the New START Treaty, which had limited both countries to a maximum of 1,550 long-range nuclear warheads. That agreement did indeed expire, raising the possibility of another nuclear arms race. The farthest away from midnight the clock has ever been set was 17 minutes to midnight in 1991, after the signing of the first START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In that announcement, the Bulletin argued that the world had entered a new era. As Sophie McBain summarized the board's sentiment in The Guardian, quote, "Humankind had made more progress in reducing the risk of nuclear warfare than originally thought possible. The initial design of the clock did not allow the hand to go back further than 15 minutes, end quote. Suffice to say, that trend didn't last long. Within a few years, the clock had gone back down under 15 minutes, and it's been gradually declining ever since, to the point that the Bulletin is now regularly referring to the threat level in terms of seconds to midnight rather than minutes, in, quote, a warning to leaders and citizens around the world that the international security situation is now more dangerous than it has ever been, even at the height of the Cold War, end quote. The Bulletin's statement, released this past January to accompany the setting of the clock at 85 seconds to midnight, reads in part, quote, Russia, China, the United States, and other major countries have become increasingly aggressive, adversarial, and nationalistic. Hard-won global understandings are collapsing, accelerating a winner-takes-all great power competition and undermining the international cooperation critical to reducing existential risks. Far too many leaders have grown complacent and indifferent, in many cases adopting rhetoric and policies that accelerate rather than mitigate those risks. Because of this failure of leadership, the Bulletin's Science and Security Board sets the Doomsday Clock the closest it has ever been to catastrophe, end quote. So, yeah, I mean, I personally don't think the situation today is closer to catastrophe than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they've got good reasons. I mean,
Yeah.
those are pretty good reasons.
I mean, I am in no way inclined to argue that things are hunky-dory in the world today, but I would say that things were more dangerous during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, it does feel like we were right there, and it also feels like there's a tendency for, like we've already discussed, for the clock to keep moving forward in order to signal the seriousness of certain issues. And I appreciate the motives behind that, but it does create this sort of expectation that, well, of course, the clock's just going to keep getting closer to midnight. Like, of course, that's going to keep happening. And there's an element of that that makes me kind of roll my eyes in a way that that's perhaps unwarranted, but I don't know. Can you relate to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm thinking of while you said that is the concept of mutually assured destruction, which I was not planning to say anything about in this presentation, but it really kind of was our salvation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, there's that great Sting song, Russians, where he says the Russians love their children too. And that's ultimately why neither side pulls the trigger on nuclear war, because we love our children, you know? So if you consider mutually assured destruction to be a real thing, which I do, then perhaps we were safer in the early 1960s than we are today.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yeah. I mean, the flip side to that is, by that argument, then the most dangerous period should have been when nuclear weapons were relatively rare, when it might have been possible for a leader to convince themselves that, sure, we'll drop a few nukes and win this war, but it's not going to trigger a global catastrophe. Whereas now, there are just so many that there's no scenario in which a nuclear exchange does not completely obliterate civilization. And so in that case, things do get safer as the weapons proliferate, which is profoundly counterintuitive. I've always felt that it was a weird step that our nations took, where offensive weapons were allowed under the treaties, but defensive weapons like the anti-missile systems were often outlawed under treaty. That seemed nonsensical to me, but it does run counter to that. The safety of the mutual assured destruction, that if one side feels like they can protect themselves, then that's essentially destabilizing.
Yes. You know, I agree with much of that. I just want to point out, you started that comment by saying that arguably the least safe time should be when nuclear weapons were rare, right? But that actually is historically the case. The only time we've ever used nuclear weapons is when exactly one country had them, you know?
Right. Didn't need to worry about a nuclear weapon coming back the other way. Yeah.
Correct. So you're quite right about that observation. The Bulletin's current CEO, Alexandra Bell, who spent much of her career working on nuclear arms control, suspects that people have a false sense of security because nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945, as I was just saying. And we choose not to consider how much of our survival is due to dumb luck. Quote, "We've been lucky because the odds are not in our favor. The more weapons that exist for longer, the more likely it is something will go wrong." End quote. The clock is a stark visual metaphor synthesizing a variety of complex and esoteric threats into a measurable and easily understandable metric. The Bulletin's goal is explicitly not to incite panic or imply that global doom is imminent. Instead, it's to serve as a call to action, forcing politicians, policymakers, and citizens across the world to reckon with all these potentially existential risks by holding their governments accountable so that they'll hopefully take steps towards sustainable peace.
I feel like I can challenge that statement on two fronts. First, that is not intended as a signal that doom is imminent, when clearly the metaphor of the Doomsday Clock getting closer to midnight expresses imminent doom. I don't see that is defensible at all. And the second is the extent to which it does force citizens and leaders to reckon. I don't feel like it's forcing anybody to do anything.
Yes.
But I appreciate your perspective on that.
Yeah, so your second comment is also anticipating some of the criticism I'm going to get to in a minute. The way I've structured this is I'm going to make all the arguments for the clock and then get to some of the arguments against the clock.
Okay.
And then I'll give you my 2 cents at the end. All right, so the Doomsday Clock generates alarming headlines that grab people's attention. The fact that you're asking me this question is evidence of that. But it's also part of the zeitgeist. There's been a host of pop cultural references or allusions to the clock over the years. Just a partial listing includes the fiction of Stephen King, the music of The Clash, The Who, and Pink Floyd, a music video by Sting, TV series like Doctor Who and Madam Secretary, and comic book series like Watchmen. Cultural penetration is certainly a sign of impact. And I think it's fair to say the clock has become an iconic fixture in public consciousness, and not only with American baby boomers. According to the Bulletin's website, its readership is international, with more than half of online visitors coming from outside the United States. It also skews young, with half under the age of 35. The clock's primary impact seems to be its effectiveness in raising awareness of impending threats, and then spurring advocacy to neutralize such threats, rather than as an instrument of diplomatic leverage. The Bulletin's leaders liken their process to, quote, a doctor making a diagnosis. We consider as many symptoms, measurements, and circumstances as we can. Then we come to a judgment that sums up what could happen if leaders and citizens don't take action to treat the conditions, end quote. The cosmologist Lawrence Krauss told the New York Times that the clock, quote, captures for one day deep existential threats that for most of the rest of the year aren't talked about, end quote. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. But the practical impact of the clock in the real world is debatable. The Bulletin's annual statements serve as useful pedagogical tools to spark conversations and keep the societal spotlight on topics like nuclear arms control and climate change. That said, it's something of a chicken and egg dilemma to trace specific policy changes back to the clock's settings or its influence. Clock skeptics have accused the Bulletin of a range of sins, from historical pessimism to imprecision to political bias. Let's start with bias. Writing for Investors Business Daily, John Merline recounts how the clock averages closer to midnight during Republican presidential administrations than during Democratic ones, and concludes that it's a, quote, more reliable measure of liberal angst than any actual risk of doomsday, end quote. Keith B. Payne, writing in the Conservative National Review, agrees that the clock is, quote, pure political flim-flam, end quote, but also points out how, quote, the clock keepers cannot know enough about the myriad of possible perceptions, motives, beliefs, and behaviors of nuclear powers to predict with any precision the onset of a nuclear war, end quote. Payne puts his fingers on something that clearly motivates the bulletin's clock setters. I quote him again. The movement of the clock seems to have been affected only by developments in the areas of nuclear testing and formal arms control. Whether these developments have much, if anything, to do with the probability and timing of war is questionable, end quote. In case you're wondering, criticism of the Doomsday Clock doesn't just come from the political right. The U of C astrophysicist Daniel Holtz supports the clock overall, but warns that the clock setters must think about the psychology of how it will be interpreted. Quote, if people feel powerless and so petrified that they can't engage, then we're making things worse, end quote.
Yeah.
In 2023, James Ball wrote a withering takedown for the New Statesman, the self-described leading progressive political and cultural magazine in the United Kingdom, that echoed Holtz's point. Quote, it's certainly not empowering. The image of mere seconds remaining doesn't energize or galvanize us. It suggests it's too late and we should just wait for the end. Given how widely reported its annual updates are, it serves to genuinely disturb or even terrify some people with no good productive end. Has the bulletin bothered to read any of the extensive literature on how to mobilize people against existential threats? If it had, it would surely know that hope is at least as important as fear, end quote.
Yeah, I think that's a very trenchant critique, that the clock is a stick without a carrot, right?
Right.
It's a boogeyman that intends to motivate through fear. And I do feel like these sorts of things do have often the opposite effect of what they intended. Because if the intent is to motivate people to vote for less confrontational politicians and for policies that would be generally progressively aligned, like addressing climate change, what we actually see are younger voters feel like the world is toast and they are disengaging with the political process because they see it as pointless, right, as a pointless endeavor within a lost cause. And so, I think that there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, I agree. And this guy, James Ball, writing in the New Statesman, had a lot of other good criticisms. I'm going to mention a few more because I think his article was really helpful to me in understanding the arguments against the Doomsday Clock. Ball also critiqued the clock's normalization of catastrophe. Quote, in the entire history of the clock, it has never ticked back earlier than 17 minutes to midnight, which feels like having a system that judges risk on a scale of 1 to 100 and then never letting it drop below 99.
Mm-hmm.
If you're always on red alert, you're never actually on red alert, end quote. He likened the clock setters to a secular doomsday cult. Catherine Pandora, a researcher of the history of science at the University of Oklahoma, cautioned that, quote, asking successive generations of people to sustain a constant sense of emergency is a contradiction in terms. The unintended effects of this directive can impede a successful resolution of the issue at hand and undermine the working relationship between experts and non-experts, end quote. In 2016, the Swedish neuroscientist Anders Sandberg suggested that the clock's mishmash of existential threats can induce paralysis because, quote, you can't live your life at 3 minutes to midnight, end quote. He offered that people might be more likely to turn the clock back by tackling smaller, more incremental challenges, like working to prevent the accidental detonation of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. It's so telling, isn't it, that the original clock was designed so that it could not be turned any further back than 15 minutes to midnight, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if at the time that clock had been designed, if they had awareness that this would still be a thing 80 years later if they would have built the clock differently.
Right.
Or if that was simply intended to capture a certain aspect of that moment in time. Because, yeah, if you're always in red alert, then at some point red alert starts to just seem, well, this is life now.
Yes.
It ceases to be motivating because there's no longer a feeling of crisis associated with it.
The nuclear physicist who cried wolf, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it clearly was designed for its time and place during the height of the Cold War, and maybe has outlived its usefulness as a design, But I have a few additional criticisms of the clock that I want to run by you before we get to what I think. Because the clock is a symbol as opposed to an empirical scientific measurement, many criticize its lack of a transparent, formal methodology and argue that its outputs instead capture the historical subjectivity of its programmers. The Harvard cognitive psychologist and most optimistic man on earth, Steven Pinker, in his 2019 book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, condemned the clock as a political stunt, citing the words of one of its founders that its purpose was, quote, to preserve civilization by scaring men into rationality, end quote. Pinker sees the clock as an example of humanity's predisposition toward historical pessimism. As for the lack of empiricism, it's easy to understand the metaphor of midnight as the end of human existence, a consequence of all-out nuclear war. But how does the metaphor work for climate change, which unfolds more gradually than nuclear annihilation?
Yeah. Or even more so, what you mentioned, that they're now taking into account misinformation.
Yes.
And that sort of thing.
Yes.
Like that doesn't lend itself to a sudden moment of doom.
Yes, quite right. So one of the Bulletin's former executive directors recalled the clock setting debates growing more heated after climate change became part of the calculus, with one scientist arguing that its irreversible consequences were so catastrophic that midnight had already come and gone. As Rachel Bronson, the Bulletin's former CEO, told the University of Chicago's Big Brains podcast, quote, it's much harder to have a kind of before and after midnight clear sense of what that means, because for the climate, there are tipping points that you can't come back from. And you won't feel those effects until years out, but it'll be very difficult to recover from, end quote.
Yeah.
Tristan Hopper, writing for the Canadian website National Post, thinks the Bulletin's conflation of the nuclear and climate change issues is not a feature, but a bug. Quote, there are plenty of things to worry about regarding climate change, but no rational person thinks it could spawn an immediate doomsday in which all life is instantaneously erased. It shows a staggering lack of context to suggest otherwise, end quote. Hopper's piece is full of cogent criticisms of the methodology or lack thereof behind the clock. He describes the Bulletin's annual clock setting statement as, quote, a wildly unscientific ritual that is shockingly bad at predicting actual nuclear risk. It is literally 18 pages of speculation and punditry masquerading as scientific portent, end quote.
Yeah.
He decries the clock's lack of quantitative metrics and compares it unfavorably to other public warning systems. This criticism really resonated with me. I will see what you think, Mark. And I'm quoting Hopper. The U.S. and Canadian debt clocks, for instance, provide a running tally of each country's surging debt, a much more accurate measure than if they were simply static analog clocks reading 2 minutes to default. Color-coded wildfire indicators let vacationers know how vigilant they should be about campfires or cigarette smoking. Imagine if Parks Canada simply put up pictures of giant clocks at all its parks reading, it is 10 minutes to wildfire, end quote. What do you think of that criticism?
Yeah. I mean, increasingly as we're going through this the Doomsday Clock is starting to feel like a useful metaphor in 1947 that is, as it is applied to more and more things, becomes much less useful and cogent and constructive within the world today. And that it basically should have stayed within his lane. Like it served a particular purpose, and it is not eternal and not infinitely flexible. And the attempt to make it both eternal and infinitely flexible lends itself to the criticisms that you've cited here.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to my thoughts about this very shortly. That's not one of them, but I think there's a lot to say about what your point that maybe this is something fixed in amber. This was relevant in the 1940s and 50s, maybe the 60s, but not since then. That's something we should put a pin in and come back to. I want to conclude with a couple more of Tristan Hopper's criticisms, and then we'll get to our conversation at the end. So to contrast with that 10 minutes to wildfire remark, Hopper cites various scientists and national security experts who have concluded that in the next 25 years, there's a 6.8% chance of a nuclear war that will kill more people than World War II, which he describes as, quote, what a reasoned assessment of risk actually looks like, end quote. Hopper mocks the fact that the end of the Cold War merited the clock moving to 17 minutes before midnight with this zinger, quote, one of the greatest coups for peace in history, and the best they could do is give humanity just enough time to listen to In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida before the world ended, end quote.
Right.
Don't you know that I'm loving you? In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, baby. Don't you know that I'll always be true?
So that's Cher and Iron Butterfly in the same podcast, folks. And they said it couldn't be done.
Well, no one can set limits on mansplaining. If there's something that cannot be done, we will do an episode on it, and we will do it.
That's right. You got it. Tristan Hopper also thinks it strains credulity that the clock wasn't moved much closer to midnight during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I agree with this. Or how about on that fateful day of September 26, 1983, a day many of us don't even realize happened, when a system malfunction caused the USSR to falsely detect an incoming U.S. missile strike that would likely have ended the world were it not for a single Soviet duty officer who made a courageous decision not to implement the required protocol for ordering a retaliatory strike. So I just presented a damning case against the Doomsday Clock. I think you would agree, since you agreed with a lot of these criticisms.
Yeah.
And yet, despite all these reasonable arguments about how it's either counterproductive catastrophizing or alarmist clickbait, I'm not ready to throw it under the proverbial bus. As I said at the top, I'm ambivalent about the clock's impact, but not about its existence. Call me naive, but I'm inclined to give the folks at the Bulletin the benefit of the doubt. After all, these are not publicity-seeking sensationalists making these determinations. The Bulletin is a nonprofit staffed by serious, sober-minded scientists and other world-renowned experts. Rather than aiming for the shock value of tabloid news, these folks designed an educational tool that they hoped would convey the unprecedented dangers of the nuclear age in a way that words alone could not. I don't believe, and neither could I find any evidence in my research, that they're trying to build or maintain an audience for the Doomsday Clock, which is something you said at the beginning of your question when you gave it to me at the end of the last episode about something that's common of catastrophizing is when you're building or maintaining an audience. When it bleeds, it leads, right? So you lead with doom all the time. I don't think that's happening here. And if people question their motives, that's arguably because we're in an utterly cynical post-truth era where everyone's motives are ripe for questioning. It's also worth noting that despite the seeming despair reflected by 85 Seconds to Midnight, the clock setters are not a bunch of Debbie Downers. Many of them are optimistic about humanity's thus far unerring ability to steer itself away from the brink, whether it be through technological innovations like mRNA vaccines for infectious diseases, or the hard work and steady progress of diplomacy, which has drastically reduced nuclear stockpiles in recent decades. They're certainly bullish about the emerging science, if not the feckless and ignorant politicians who fail to mitigate our problems by acting on that science or following expert advice. Rachel Bronson, one of the ultimate insiders as the former CEO of the Bulletin, said this about why she doesn't despair about the proximity of doomsday. Quote, "I think, like anything, the more involved you are, the more optimistic you can be, only to know that there's really good people working on these issues." End quote. She added an anecdote about how during the board's annual briefings and deliberations, participants were always more nervous about the dangers they had not been studying than the ones in their own field. Quote, "Whatever your expertise is, you think someone else's is scarier, in part because it's always scarier when it's unknown." End quote. From a clock setting perspective, I think it's a safe bet that things will get worse before they get better. After all, since the clock reached 85 seconds to midnight in January, our idiot president and his enablers in Israel started a war with Iran. And a recent pissing match between the White House and the AI developer Anthropic revealed the U.S. government's desire to have unrestricted military access to AI. The same AI that opted in war games to use nuclear weapons against military targets 95% of the time.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, whether the Doomsday Clock simply provokes increased awareness or leads to actual political change, we should be happy about its overall success in prompting generations of citizens the world over to think about human culpability for the potential dangers posed by science and technology. That's a good thing. The astrophysicist and board member Robert Rossner likened the Doomsday Clock to the proverbial canary in the coal mine, prompting us to take quick action to save our lives.
I think my main question is, has it? Like, has it prompted quick action? Because I'm thinking back, we are talking 80 years. Is there a single documented occasion where the setting of the Doomsday Clock clearly and evidently resulted in action being taken within the political sphere? Like, can we think of a single example? Or are we just imagining awareness had some sort of effect and we're assuming that that effect was positive?
For me, at least, it's the latter. I couldn't find anything in my research that suggested direct cause and effect.
Yeah.
That the politicians or world leaders are paying attention to the Doomsday Clock and it's motivating them. I think the fact that the Doomsday Clock is in the zeitgeist is playing on people subconsciously, and I think the JFK administration's quick resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis is a sign that they knew that Doomsday was a couple steps away,
Yeah. Well, sure.
And that's informed by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
Yeah, I'm not.
If you recall, Mark, there were generals counseling JFK to drop a nuke on Cuba and start a war.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that, but it seems like you are inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, give the clock the benefit of the doubt. And I don't know. I feel like JFK would have been aware of the imminence of nuclear catastrophe with or without the Doomsday Clock. I don't think he was relying on that to understand the gravity of the threat. I would have been concerned if he was relying on that. Like with all the information available to him, all the experts within his circle, if he needed a group of scientists publishing a newsletter out of Chicago to understand the gravity of that threat, then that threat was much more severe than I ever possibly could have imagined.
Okay. Well, but what about you and me? What about voters? What about the very next election after JFK's assassination, where Lyndon Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater, and everyone in the United States, or 60% of the United States, was convinced that we were going to reach nuclear Armageddon with Goldwater in control? That was arguably motivated by consciousness raising of things like the Doomsday Clock.
I mean, arguably, yes. It requires the benefit of the doubt. Like, in the absence of the benefit of the doubt, you could just as easily argue that the Doomsday Clock has had no measurable effect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
So I have one last thing to say, little bit off point, but this is how I wanted to close this episode. If you've already surrendered to the chronic catastrophizing, if the deteriorating state of the world has sent you into a tailspin, and if the Doomsday Clock's current setting gives you the heebie-jeebies, well, you're not alone. Maybe we can help. If you go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, you'll find the promo clip for this episode near the top of that page. If you click on the comments for that promo clip, there you'll find my list of sources for this episode. Click on the link for the first source on my list, which is for a completely different type of countdown clock that I'm guessing will make you feel a whole lot better.
Okay, I've clicked on that link and I'm looking at that page, and I will not spoil the surprise for our listeners. I'll let them discover it for themselves. But yes, it's a countdown to something that I am very much looking forward to.
All right, so I think we have a slight difference of opinion on this one.
Yeah.
But I think, have I persuaded you at least that this is not an example of crass marketing, that these people want to keep their name in the headlines every year? I mean, couldn't you say they mean well, but maybe they're just ineffectual?
I do. I'm willing to grant that they are well-intentioned. I would say that the Doomsday Clock itself is intended to be attention capturing. I feel like that is clearly the purpose of it,
yes,
rather than it just being a press release where they express their concern about affairs. The metaphor of the clock, the fact that they roll it out every year, is intended to capture attention. And no, I don't feel like they're trying to build an audience, like some influencer on Instagram. I would not put them on that level. I do think that they are attempting to capture attention, but I believe that they are well-intentioned, that they believe that intention should be focused on certain things. I'm willing to grant that much. I think for me, the crux of it is something you touched on, which is hope versus fear. Like, they think of fear from its inception, going back to 1947. They wanted to scare people into taking action on things that they felt were urgent priorities. And as we have discussed on this podcast before, fear is a powerful motivator. We see it all the time in our political discourse. The politicians who inspire fear are able to get people to the polls. Fear is a very powerful political force. I do believe it is a very corrosive force, however. Fear does not inspire us to the things that we should perhaps aspire to.
Right.
Hope does. Hope is a less powerful motivator than fear, but it's a more powerful builder of things that you want to carry forward into the future. I think that fear cuts away at us in a way. It cuts away at our foundations in a way that hope does not. And I feel like maybe for me, that's my biggest objection to the Doomsday Clock, is it inspires fear. It does not inspire hope. If anything, it lessens hope. And I feel like that is ultimately counter to its mission.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you're not alone in feeling that way. And we've spoken about hope and fear repeatedly in this podcast. And I do agree with the general point that there needs to be a little hope infused with the fear for there to be any chance of society reacting and bettering itself. I already mentioned that I thought the 10 minutes to midnight is a little bit imprecise and perhaps not clear enough. But I think maybe my main beef with the Doomsday Clock is that they've bitten off a little more than they can chew. Maybe it should have just stuck to nuclear Armageddon, right? Which is the original inspiration for the compelling visual. And clearly annihilation is something that comes quickly and potentially ends the earth, makes the earth uninhabitable. And that alone should perhaps be the subject of the Doomsday Clock. And in 2007, when they started expanding the rationales for doomsday to include climate change, and now AI and infectious disease and misinformation, disinformation, it's kind of getting far afield now, and it becomes much harder to kind of rein it in and make it speak to us in a meaningful way, you know?
Yeah. Or even define what they mean by doomsday.
Yes.
Like you mentioned earlier, doomsday within a nuclear weapon scenario is very clear. It's when the bombs drop and everything goes kaboom. Doomsday for climate change is a lingering, excruciating process of dwindling towards extinction. Doomsday in the case of epidemiology is probably more like something like 80% of the world's population dying in something on the same level as the bubonic plague.
Right.
Like it is, and then with AI, who knows what we're even talking about there. So it does, it lessens the clarity of what they're talking about the more they extend the range of things that they add to the hopper.
Yeah, okay, so we have an appropriately nuanced view here. And I think you're a little bit more down on the concept of the Doomsday Clock than I am, but there are significant criticisms. But I think we both agree that they mean well. It's well-intentioned.
Maybe we can convince them to come out with a salvation clock, where reasons for hope send the salvation clock, towards midnight. But midnight is like midnight on New Year's Eve, where when it hits midnight, everyone celebrates and kisses each other, and we all drink champagne.
Well, that's where that countdown clock I added at the end may come in, because I think some of us will be kissing and drinking champagne when that clock hits 0.
Indeed.
Just another teaser for our audience.
Okay,
well, I have a question for you for next time. You ready for this?
I'm ready for it.
All right. You're going to think of this as a totally Joe question, but sometimes Joe does Joe questions. So I've wanted to ask you about gerrymandering for the longest time, Mark, but I was waiting for the issue to ripen sufficiently before we tackled it. In the wake of the Supreme Court's disemboweling of the Voting Rights Act that opened the door for all the Confederate states to redistrict away every black member of Congress who isn't a Republican, I think this issue is now as ripe as it'll ever be. So it's time for you to mansplain it to me. I'd like you to recount the history of gerrymandering and then weigh in on whether it's the worst today that it's ever been.
Okay, yeah, it's a very Joe question.
He said with a frown on his face.
With a sigh. But like you say, it's never been more pertinent. So it's not going to be a fun topic, but it's definitely one worth discussing. So I'll take that one on and come back with something that will probably depress both of us and most of our listeners. So look forward to that, folks. Look forward to that in a couple of weeks. Okay, well, I have my marching orders, which is to march into a political morass and learn as much as I can about it. While I'm there, perhaps you'll be contemplating our doom, but I hope that you will have hope. I hope that you'll look towards the future with hope rather than just with the expectation of doom. Because if there's one thing that will get us through the challenges that we face today, it is hope, more so than fear. I truly believe that. And I also hope that you will rejoin with us in the next episode, which will come down the pike in 2 or 3 weeks. But until then, that was Joe, and this is Mark, and we'll see you next time.
We'll talk to you soon, and stay tuned for a very scary song.
And here's tonight's forecast. Heavy clouds of existential dread with a 50% chance of annihilation. The nuclear physicists are throwing a fit. Oh, the humanity. Conservation biologists are losing their shit. Such insanity. Cue the self-appointed arbiters of the end of the world. Pencil-necked geeks with their flags unfurled. And here's what they have to say. Things are getting hairy. It's time to say goodbye. The world is very scary, and we're all gonna die. For those of you who say, oh, it's just a clock and not even a real one, prepare for a shock. You may think the yearly bulletins are a little wacky, but the Doomsday Clock is as real as Nagasaki, and here's what it has to say. Things are getting hairy. It's time to say goodbye. The world is very scary, and we're all gonna die. You can sit in your parlors and drink your vermouth. How uncouth. You're just ducking reality. You can't handle the truth. We've studied the threat vectors. There's a reason for fright. We see the light. If we were you, we wouldn't sleep very soundly tonight. If you don't heed our warnings, you're in for a shock. Better prostrate yourselves before the countdown clock, for we are the truth tellers, cold and precise. Utter terror and total panic will suffice. Quite nice. To all of you fans of reversing the hands, we say so much for your best laid plans. 85, 84, 83, 82. Midnight is coming, it's coming for you. Now repeat after us. Things are getting hairy. It's time to say goodbye. The world is very scary, and we're all gonna die. Delete all users.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.